from palace to prison. There is a widespread belief that former presidents are immune to prosecution for actions taken during their time in office. But how true is that? In today's episode, we look at 10 former heads of state who are presently behind bars for crimes committed during their presidency. Number 1. Charles Taylor of Liberia. Charles Taylor, a protege of Muammar Gaddafi, became president of Liberia in August 1997 after winning a landslide victory in the 1997 general elections. In 1989, he had launched a Gaddafi-funded armed uprising to overthrow the former regime, which plunged Liberia into 8 years of civil war. Although international observers reckoned his election as free and fair, voters feared that Taylor would resume the civil war if he lost the elections. Throughout his presidency, Taylor was alleged to have smuggled arms to Sierra Leone's rebels in exchange for blood diamonds. This contravened a UN embargo against arms sales to Liberia at the time. He also assisted the rebels in recruiting child soldiers and is believed to have personally coordinated the Sierra Leonean rebel operations in Liberia. By this time, the armed conflict in Sierra Leone had resulted in over 50,000 deaths, with most of the victims being women and children. In early 2003, a Guinean-backed rebellion against Taylor took control of northern Liberia. Later that year, another Ivorian-backed rebellion against Taylor emerged from the south and rapidly progressed towards Monrovia, the capital. By the summer of 2003, Taylor controlled less than a third of the national territory. At this point, the president of Nigeria offered Taylor exile in his country. In June 2003, a special court for the armed conflict in Sierra Leone indicted Taylor for war crimes. To make matters worse, the prosecutor added that Taylor had harbored Osama bin Laden's al-Qaeda members connected with the bombings of the US embassies in Kenya and Tanzania on August 7, 1998, which resulted in 224 deaths. This prompted the US Congress in November 2003 to pass a bill demanding Taylor's extradition. Immediately, Nigeria gave in to the US government's pressure and agreed to hand him over. Taylor disappeared from his state-provided residence in Calabar, Nigeria. On March 29, 2006, he was apprehended while trying to cross the border into Cameroon. On April 26, 2012, Taylor was sentenced to 50 years in prison for aiding and abetting war crimes and crimes against humanity. His release is set for 2062. Number 2. Alberto Fujimori of Peru. Fujimori, a son of Japanese immigrants, became president of Peru in July 1990 after winning a surprise victory at polls. During his time in office, Peruvians witnessed unprecedented levels of human rights violations, including the summary execution of suspected insurgents and compulsory sterilization of up to 300,000 indigenous women without proper anesthesia as part of a population control program. Fujimori privatized hundreds of state-owned companies, generating over $9 billion, of which only a tiny fraction ever got into state coffers. When faced with corruption charges in 2000, he fled to his ancestral Japan and sent his resignation by fax. The resignation was rejected by Congress, which preferred an impeachment trial. He later escaped from Japan to Chile, where he was arrested and extradited to Peru to face trial. In 2009, he was convicted of human rights abuses and sentenced to 25 years in prison. Number 3. Arnoldo Aleman of Nicaragua. Arnoldo Aleman became president of Nicaragua in January 1997. After beating his principal opponent Daniel Ortega in the October 96 elections. In December 2003, Aleman was convicted for a series of crimes that included money laundering, embezzlement, and public corruption. During his trial, prosecutors presented evidence of a $13,755 Ritz-Carlton hotel bill, a $30,878 Taj Mahal hotel bill, $68,506 handicraft purchase receipts, a $22,530 carpet purchase, all charged to a government credit card while on a private trip with his wife to India. These and many other outrageous expenses happened at a time of alarming public corruption scandals in Nicaragua, when the average citizen makes only about $430 per year. Yes, you heard it right, $430 per year. Arnoldo was sentenced to 20 years in prison. Number 4. Omar Al-Bashir of Sudan. After ousting the unstable government in a military coup in 1989, Al-Bashir assumed the posts of Chief of State, Prime Minister, Chief of Armed Forces, and Minister of Defense all at the same time, and eventually appointed himself President of Sudan. He banned all political parties, private newspapers, imprisoned key political figures and journalists, institutionalized Sharia law on the national level, and carried out a series of summary executions. He later organized presidential elections in which he was the only candidate eligible by law to run. Of course, he won all of the votes. In April 2009, he was removed from power by the Sudanese armed forces after several months of protest and civil unrest. The Sudanese people had witnessed a horrifying magnitude of tyranny. In December 2019, Al-Bashir was sentenced to 2 years in prison for money laundering, while arrangements are being made for his transfer to International Criminal Court to face crimes against humanity. Number 5. Antonio Saca of El Salvador. Born to Palestinian immigrant parents from Bethlehem, Antonio Saca became president of El Salvador after winning the presidential elections of June 2004. Saca grossly abused the power of his presidency for his personal gains. His level of corruption went beyond the pale, even by Salvadorian standards. He issued decrees and selectively enforced regulations with specific intent to benefit his personal business interests. A U.S. Embassy report revealed that he misspent $219 million of unaccounted government funds and pressured mayors of his party to vote for specific candidates under the penalty of being suspended as municipal authorities. By the end of his presidency, his multiple multi-million-dollar mansions and the overall enormity of his wealth were way beyond his income and investment before his presidency. In September 2018, Saca was convicted of illegal enrichment and sentenced to 10 years in prison. Number 6. Hissene Habbre of Chad. Hissene Habbre came to power in 1982 after overthrowing the current regime in a military coup and appointing himself president. His regime was characterized by widespread atrocities and human rights abuses. He created a secret police force specifically for the torture and execution of his opponents, including forcing the mouths of detainees around smoking exhaust pipes of running cars. He practiced ethnic cleansing, where he sought to exterminate certain ethnic groups deemed unfriendly to his regime by killing their people in masses. He rounded up women in masses, which he transported to the desert to be used as sex slaves for his soldiers. In November 1990, one of Habre's former military officials, Idris Deby, launched a rebellion from the neighboring Sudan that overthrew Habre's regime. Habre's trial dragged for almost 26 years as people kept coming up with new pieces of evidence of his atrocities. Finally, on May 30, 2016, Habbre was found guilty of sexual slavery and killing over 40,000 people and was sentenced to life in prison. Number 7. Myung-Bak of South Korea. Before his election in 2008 as president of South Korea, Myung-Bak was CEO of Hyundai Electronics and mayor of Seoul. Lee's campaign goals included a 7% annual growth in GDP and $40,000 income per capita, which was entirely believable considering his business background and career success. A few days before the elections, Lee promised to donate all of his assets to society. When he took office, he did just the opposite. He was highly involved in bribery and corruption. During his trial in 2018, evidence showed that he received 11 billion Korean won worth of bribes and 35 billion Korean won worth of slush funds from major corporations. Also, he received $6 million in exchange for a presidential pardon from the chairman of Samsung, who was serving time for tax evasion and stock fraud. Lee also embezzled funds set for the establishment of government agencies and other state projects. In October 2018, he was found guilty of bribery, embezzlement, and abuse of power and was sentenced to 17 years in prison. Number 8. Park Geun-Hye of South Korea. Park Geun-Hye became president of South Korea in 2013 after a surprise victory in the 2012 presidential election. Park's party wasn't expected to be victorious at the elections due to the corruption scandals of her predecessor and fellow party member Myung-Bak. Park's victory was largely attributed to her leadership skills and her pledge not to follow in Lee's footsteps. Voters believed her, but they were seriously mistaken as her presidency was also characterized by tyranny, censorship, and abuse of power. She had a personal relationship with Choi Soon-sil and gave her access to classified government information, even though the latter held no government position. Then Choi used her influence to extort an estimated 77 billion Korean won from large business conglomerates. When top presidential aides got arrested for abuse of power, they confessed to working on President Park's orders. Park established a commission just to monitor and prosecute her social media critics, indicting some on charges of defamation. In November 2015, over 80,000 protesters took to the street, demanding Park's resignation. In response, she had security forces fire tear gas and sprayed water cannons at the crowd. In November 2016, over 1 million South Koreans took part in a protest at Gwanghwamun Square, close to the presidential residence, demanding her impeachment. When another demonstration of the same magnitude happened a week later, she fired her cabinet members, including the prime minister. This resulted in further controversies, especially because the firing was carried out through text messages. By the end of November 2016, things had gone out of hand. Pak presented her resignation, which the National Assembly rejected, preferring an impeachment trial. Pak was removed from office in March 2017 by the Constitutional Court and sentenced to 25 years in prison. She is presently behind bars at the Seoul Detention Center. Number 9. Abdulla Yameen of the Maldives. Yameen became the second democratically elected president of the Maldives after winning the 2013 presidential election under the Progressive Party. Yameen's presidency was marked by large-scale infringement of human rights, including abuse of women, arbitrary mass arrests, and instituting flogging as punishment. He issued decrees preventing opposition parties from contesting in elections. He censored the media and silenced all critics. He is alleged to have ordered the assassination of Yameen Rashid, a journalist and notorious critic of the regime, whose body was found with 34 stab wounds, and the disappearance of Ahmed Rilwan, a popular Maldivian anti-corruption blogger. In February 2018, before the presidential elections, Yameen declared a state of emergency and arrested several top politicians, 2 Supreme Court judges, and even the former president of the republic, Mamoun Abdul Gayoom. Yameen was eventually defeated in the September 2018 presidential elections, in which he sought to win a second term. On February 6, 2019, the Maldivian Supreme Court found Yameen guilty of abuse of power, money laundering, and theft. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison. Before we get to our top spot, please do not forget to give us a like and to subscribe to our channel. Number 10. Nicolas Sarkozy of France. Sarkozy became president of France after winning the April 2007 presidential elections under the UMP party. In 2011, Gaddafi's son Saif al-Islam said in an interview with Euronews that Libya donated over 50 million euros to finance Sarkozy's 2007 presidential campaign in exchange for influence and favors. These allegations were substantiated by an investigative website, Mediapart, which published documents providing the payment of the sum, and testimony by Ziad Taqiyuddin, a Lebanese-French businessman who claimed to have handed the briefcase full of cash to Sarkozy. When things couldn't get any worse, French magistrates received records from former Libyan oil minister Shukri Ghanem with details of the payment to Sarkozy. A few weeks later, the former oil minister's lifeless body was found floating in the Danube in Austria, thereby preventing evidence corroboration. During his presidency, Sarkozy also tried to bribe a judge, Gilbert Azibert, with an appointment to a senior position in exchange for confidential information relating to an ongoing investigation into one of Sarkozy's scandals. On March 1, 2021, Sarkozy was convicted of corruption and influence peddling and sentenced to 3 years, 2 suspended and 1 in prison. He would be reunited with his prime minister François Fillon, who was sentenced in June 2020 to 5 years in prison for fraud, and his cabinet minister Georges Tron, who was sentenced in February 2021 to 6 years in prison for sexual assault and rape. Thanks for watching, and do well to check out our next video right here.